Hey everybody, Rock DIY here. I've got my Kubota BX23S. I've had this since 2020 and I now have 469.3 hours, so almost 500 hours. And so based on the number of hours, it's obvious that I've done a lot of work with this tractor. One of the things I've had an issue with is I try to grease all the Zerk fittings continuously. I try to keep it in shape where it needs to be, try to stay on the maintenance. But unfortunately, I think in some cases during the summer, the grease, and it's probably also dependent on the type of grease that you use. There are recommended greases that you should be using on the Kubota BX23S, but in some cases you may not use those types and use others. I've tried to stick with the recommended greases that Kubota recommends, all the way through up to this point. And unfortunately, depending on the work that you're doing and how much, because you can do an hour's worth of work and do very little, or you can do an hour's worth of work and do a lot. And then also dependent on the weather, one of the things I've noticed is during the summer month, really working the machine hard, is that the machine gets pretty hot as far as the hydraulics, especially like on the backhoe or on the front loader. And like I said, those get pretty hot. So when those get hot, the rest of the machine gets hot, and you can replace the hydraulic fluid, you can replace the transmission, all of the fluids when they are required to be replaced. But depending on the usage, and some people will say, every time you use it, you should grease it. After you use it, you should grease it. But the issue I've run into is heavy usage during the summer. So not only heavy usage, the heat comes into play, and then also the conditions of where you work. So if you're working in an area where it's not very dusty or dirty, that's one thing. Most of the time when I do work, what I end up dealing with is, for example, right here, this is all pretty, I don't want to say dirty, it's potentially dusty, a lot of dirt flying around. So that dirt ends up into not necessarily the fittings, but for example, just to show Zerk fitting, they're all over the place on this tractor. So there's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, just on the backhoe itself. One of the issues I'm running into now is that based on the usage, I cannot put grease into any of these fittings. You can see there's grease there, all around the Zerk fitting, but none of this grease is actually going into the Zerk fitting. And it's not, well, back up a second. So if you look into this, what you'll find is that the Zerk fitting is not the problem the majority of the time. It's actually within here, and the opening that's on this pin that runs through here. So when dirt and everything else gets on here, it gets heated up, the grease breaks down, more dirt builds up, and then what you have is grease dirt rather than grease. And like I said, I've tried to stay on this, and I cannot get grease in the majority of these fittings. In fact, if you look, there's very hard black grease in here. It's pretty much it feels pretty rough. So that can be a combination of what's getting in the grease and also the type of grease that's being used. I try to use the grease that's recommended by Kubota, and up to this point I have. So now I'm at the point where I've taken the Zerk fittings out, I've placed them in a threaded piece of metal, put the grease gun on it, put grease through the Zerk fitting, and it goes through no issue. So I know it's not the Zerk fitting. The issue is within here. Now what I've done, I went out and bought what's commonly referred to as a grease hammer. I'm not trying to sell this, but this is commonly what's referred to as a grease hammer. And up front, what I'll say is, so what you do, this portion of it is pretty heavy. It's got an O-ring in it. This is heavy. This is heavy. And then what you do is you can put HEF, or you can put penetrating oil in here, and then place this on here, put it on your Zerk fitting, and then what you'll do is take a hammer and hit this. You don't want to go crazy hammering on it. You'll hammer it, and basically it's supposed to clear out the bad grease that's on whatever Zerk fitting you're trying to clear out. There's a flexible fitting as well that you can use, and that's for grease fittings that may be difficult to reach. You also have an additional grease coupler fitting for here. So what I'm going to do is run through this. Unfortunately, there are quite a few Zerk fittings on this Kubota BX23S. You can refer to one of my other videos where I talk about all of the number of Zerk fittings on the Kubota BX23S. But unfortunately for me, in this case, the majority of them will not take grease. I almost feel like it's kind of telling me that I didn't do good maintenance, but I'd like to believe that I did do good maintenance. But unfortunately, dirt, heat, grease, and unfortunately it has had an impact on my tractor, and I do want my tractor to last, so I'm going to have to resort to using this to clear out all of the points of movement that require grease. What I'm going to have to do is remove each of the Zerk fittings. I'm going to have to spray some penetrating oil into each of the fitting, let it sit for a little while, and then I'll go to using this here to clear each one of them out and hopefully not have any issues. One of the things I have noticed is that specifically with my backhoe, because I tend to use the backhoe a lot more than I use the front loader, is I can kind of feel here that there's some metal to metal contact that I normally don't hear. So hopefully by doing this, it'll take care of that issue. With the grease properly in there, it'll prevent that metal to metal contact and also prevent wear, because there's definitely going to be some wear if you don't have grease in there and you got some metal to metal contact. I removed the Zerk fitting here and cleaned the Zerk fitting out. And then also what I did is, you don't necessarily have to use this right here, but this works pretty good. So what I've done is sprayed this in there, and then also to assist, I've used this, and what I'm doing is just kind of stirring it up inside the fitting to get the grease to loosen up. It does a pretty good job from what I can tell. Okay, the other thing is, since the grease is going to come out here and here, what I'm going to do is spray the penetrating oil here and here. And it's important that when you spray the penetrating oil that you shake the can up. Now I'm just going to let it sit for a little while. So one of the things they say is not to use aerosol type penetrating oil, but I don't have that option, so I'm going to use penetrating oil from an aerosol can. I'm going to fill this up. Put this plunger on. There's an O-ring here and an O-ring there. And put this in here. I'm going to use a smaller hammer. I don't want to use a hammer that's too aggressive. And what I'm going to do is put this on. Once I get it on, I'm going to screw it on to make sure that it's on the zerk fitting. And then what I'm going to do is slowly tap this in. You can feel it kind of kicking back. One of the things you don't want to do is be overly aggressive. It's going to take about 20. I just heard it pop right now. And you can see it. The penetrating oil kind of going everywhere right now. But it's only coming out on this end. There's nothing on this end. Hopefully it was sufficient to clear it out or allow me to put new grease in it. Clean this up a little bit. I'm gonna get my grease gun and see how this is gonna work. What I don't want is grease coming out here. I want the grease to be coming out of here. Not a good sign that I'm seeing grease come out right here. I'm seeing some additional penetrating oil come out here. Alright, so you see so far, not working very well because the majority of the grease is coming out here. And I did not see anything come out there or there, even though the penetrating oil came out. This is not going to be a great process if I got to do this a multitude of times per grease fitting, because there are a lot of grease fittings on this machine, and I don't know that any grease got in that fitting at all. So unfortunately, what I may have to do is remove the bolt and the nut, pull this fitting out, put a pin to hold it in place until I get it cleaned out, because unfortunately, so typically the pin is like this, it's cylindrical, and then right in the center typically is an opening where the grease comes out, so when you put it in the zerk fitting, the grease comes out and spreads across the pin, and as of right now that is not happening. Pulled this pin out here, right here, and got it being held in place. Pulled it all the way out, cleaned it up some, but it was pretty black. This is where your grease is coming out of when you grease it. It's coming out right there, and that is the only spot. So if that spot gets gunked up, there's no grease coming out. This is recessed right here for like just maybe 5/8 of an inch is recessed, and then the rest of it is normal, but you can kind of see where it's wearing in some spots. And then the other thing is even though I took the gunk off here, there's going to be gunk up inside here. So I'm putting grease in it right now, and the grease is coming right back out. Nothing's even going in here, so what it tells me is the inside of the pin is pretty jammed up, so I'm gonna have to pull the zerk off and put some penetrating oil in there to get it cleaned up. So this is how the tool is supposed to work. Use this pin right here. I'm gonna spray some penetrating oil in it. Get some of this grease out of here. Just put the penetrating oil in there and mix it up with the grease. Grease basically falls right off. Next thing is to remove the Zerk fitting. Zerk fitting's out, and typically it's not the Zerk fitting that's the issue, and you can easily check whether it's the Zerk fitting or not even before removing it. You can carefully push the ball bearing that's in there, and if it moves in and out, then it functions as it should. But most of the time it's not the Zerk fitting, it's actually the joint. Next step is penetrating oil again. This time you're going to spray it where the Zerk fitting was. At this point, or before this point, you may want to wear gloves and goggles, because when you spray it into the joint, it's going to splash back. Let that sit for a little bit. The other thing you could do is take something that's pointed and swirl it around, because you want the penetrating oil and the grease to mix together so that it breaks the grease down. Alright, so I'm going to let that sit for a little while. This is all cleaned up now. I am going to put the Zerk fitting back on. The Zerk fitting is going all the way inside the socket, so it's difficult to get this started. This specific grease hammer is from Innovative Products of America, and what you're going to do at this point is fill this port right here full of penetrating oil. They don't recommend using aerosol cans of penetrating oil to fill these, only because there's air in it. So you're going to have a bunch of air and penetrating oil in here that you're going to have to try to get the air out of. And so I'm going to fill this up, even though I'm using an aerosol can, and then I'm going to show how to get the air out. So I've got some penetrating oil. Make sure I shake it up pretty good, and then what I'm going to do is spray it in here to fill it up. And you're going to see right away there's a bunch of air. And what I'm going to do, put the plunger in. And then what I'm going to do is invert it, give it a couple whacks on the plunger, and you'll see a bunch of air coming up at the top. Alright, you can cover that with a cloth while you're doing it, but unfortunately you won't know how much air is coming out. But when I was hitting the bottom, I noticed that the fluid was starting to come out, so I know there's not as much air. And the way that you know whether there's a bunch of air in here is when you're hammering this in. If it feels very spongy and it's kicking back, it's because there's air inside it. Alright, so now what I'm going to do is put it on the grease fitting. I'm also going to rotate it so it tightens on the grease fitting. Alright, so now that that's on there, I'm going to start hammering it. And then what you should see is in here and here, you should start seeing penetrating oil in the old grease coming out. You don't want to be overly aggressive doing this. That's one of the reasons why I'm not using a big hammer, because I don't want to be too aggressive about it. Alright, I'm starting to see some grease and penetrating oil coming out, but mainly right here. I don't see it coming out anywhere else. Loosen this up take it off. I didn't see it come out in too many places. I got some coming out here and right here, but I don't see any coming out anywhere else. But yeah, you can see where the penetrating oil and the grease mixed. I'm gonna do this again, but hopefully it's not just gonna keep coming out here, and it does come out the other side. It's loose. It's you can tell the penetrating oil and the grease mixed. But if you go over to the opposite side and put your finger in there, it's like very, very tacky. So there's the grease that's in the recess. You can see the mix of the new grease and the old grease. And right there is where the grease comes out of, and that's the only hole that the grease comes out of. I'm going to clear all that grease out of the center. The grease that is in here, in the recessed part, if it's all hardened up, it's not going to allow any grease in. You can see this grease right here is loosened up a little bit, but as you wipe it off, there's some grease that's pretty solid. It would have been nice to just use the grease tool and be done with it, but that's not going to happen, because this needs more work, and this is probably just good maintenance to conduct every once in a while. I'll clean them all out, of course. There's a lot of them, so it could take a while. You really need to be prepared to go through a lot of paper towels, rags, whatever you plan to use. You're definitely going to go through them. Doing all this work to get this all cleaned up. The real issue at this point is the actual pin and the grease that's in it. See some wear right there. It's actually not just paint, it's gone. You can feel it digging into the metal there. Behind the scenes, what I was doing is I put a different pin inside my Ultrasonic Cleaner, and right now this is about 80.7 degrees Celsius, so it's pretty hot, and you can see that it cleaned up the pin pretty good. Cleaned the Zerk fitting as well. Got my grease gun hooked up, and now I'm going to see if the grease comes out of the pin, and the hole for the grease is right there. Alright, so the grease is coming out of the pin now, which is a good sign.